Iran's recent actions mark a clear and deliberate escalation that goes far beyond symbolic responses or routine tensions. Instead of relying on indirect pressure or limited warnings, the country has shifted toward more direct and forceful measures that are designed to send a stronger message, not just to Israel, but to the entire region. Reports and observations suggest an increase in the scale, frequency, and intensity of military activity, including the use of more advanced missile systems and coordinated strikes that indicate a higher level of planning and intent. What makes this escalation particularly significant is not just the weapons being used, but the timing and confidence behind these actions. Iran appears to be signaling that it is no longer interested in maintaining the previous balance where both sides operated within certain unwritten limits. Instead, it is testing those limits, pushing boundaries to see how far it can go without triggering an overwhelming response. This creates a much more unstable situation, because once those informal boundaries are crossed, it becomes far more difficult to return to a controlled state of tension. Another critical factor is how these actions are perceived by Israel. From their perspective, this is not just another hostile move. It is being viewed as a direct and serious threat to national security. That perception alone can accelerate decision-making on the Israeli side, leading to faster and potentially more aggressive responses. When both sides begin to interpret each other's moves as existential threats rather than strategic signals, the chances of miscalculation increase dramatically. At the same time, this escalation is being closely watched by global powers, especially the United States. Increased Iranian activity puts pressure on Washington to respond, whether through military positioning, strategic warnings, or direct involvement. This adds another layer of complexity because every move Iran makes is no longer just about its immediate opponent. It's about how the world's most powerful military might react. There's also a psychological dimension to this shift. By escalating in a visible and undeniable way, Iran is shaping the narrative, projecting strength both domestically and internationally. It sends a message to its allies that it is willing to take risks, and to its adversaries that it cannot be easily contained. But this kind of signaling comes with consequences, because the stronger the message, the stronger the response it can provoke. All of this creates a chain reaction. One escalation leads to another, each one slightly more intense than the last. And as that cycle continues, the space for de-escalation shrinks, making it harder for any side to step back without appearing weak. What makes the current situation especially alarming is that it can no longer be seen as a contained regional conflict. In the past, tensions between Iran and Israel often played out through indirect means, proxy groups, cyber operations, or limited deniable strikes. But now, the scale and visibility of actions have increased to a point where major global powers are being pulled in more openly, and that changes the entire dynamic. The involvement of the United States adds a completely different level of seriousness. When American military assets begin to reposition, whether it's naval forces, air bases, or surveillance operations, it signals that the situation is being taken as a potential threat to broader international stability, not just a localized dispute. This kind of movement is not just defensive. It also acts as a warning, a show of readiness that can quickly shift into direct action if certain lines are crossed. At the same time, Israel's responses are becoming more direct and less restrained. Instead of limiting actions to covert or highly targeted operations, there is a growing willingness to take visible and decisive steps that demonstrate strength. This creates a feedback loop where each side feels the need to respond more strongly than before, raising the intensity with every exchange. What truly expands this conflict beyond the region is the network of alliances and interests connected to each country involved. Iran is not operating in isolation. It has relationships and influence across multiple groups and regions, which means any escalation can ripple outward quickly. On the other side, the United States has long-standing commitments and partnerships that can draw additional countries into the situation, even if indirectly. This interconnected web means that a single event can trigger reactions in multiple places at once. There is also a strategic dimension where global powers are watching closely, not just to respond, but to assess their own positions. Countries like Russia and China may not be directly involved on the battlefield, but their political, economic, and strategic interests are tied to how this situation unfolds. This creates a broader geopolitical tension, where decisions are being made not only based on immediate threats, but on long-term influence and global balance. As more actors become involved, even in indirect ways, the ability to control the situation becomes significantly more difficult. Communication becomes more complex, intentions become harder to interpret, and the risk of misunderstanding increases. What might begin as a calculated move by one side can be perceived as a major escalation by another, triggering responses that were never originally intended. The shift from a localized conflict to a wider, multi-layered confrontation is what makes this moment particularly fragile. It's no longer just about two sides reacting to each other. It's about multiple powers, each with their own interests, strategies, and thresholds, all interacting within the same rapidly evolving situation. One of the most concerning aspects of the current situation is the visible breakdown of diplomatic efforts that would normally act as a buffer between conflict and full-scale escalation. In past crises, even at the height of tension, there were usually back-channel communications, negotiations, or temporary agreements that helped prevent things from spiraling out of control. Right now, those channels either appear strained, ineffective, or simply ignored. When a country openly rejects ceasefire proposals or counteroffers with conditions that are unlikely to be accepted, it sends a clear signal that compromise is no longer the priority. Instead, the focus shifts toward gaining strategic advantage, even if it means prolonging or intensifying the conflict. This kind of stance makes it much harder for mediators to step in, because both sides become more rigid in their positions and less willing to make concessions. Diplomacy relies heavily on timing and trust, and both of those elements seem to be eroding. Delays in response, conflicting statements, or public declarations that contradict private negotiations all contribute to an atmosphere of uncertainty. When leaders begin to doubt the intentions of the other side, even genuine efforts at de-escalation can be viewed with suspicion, reducing their effectiveness. Another important factor is the role of international organizations and neutral parties. In theory, they are meant to facilitate dialogue and create pathways toward peace. However, when the situation escalates too quickly or becomes too politically charged, their influence can diminish. Resolutions, statements, and emergency meetings may still take place, but without cooperation from the key players involved, these efforts struggle to produce real results. There is also the issue of domestic pressure within each country. Governments are not operating in a vacuum. They are responding to public opinion, political opposition, and internal expectations. In times of heightened tension, leaders often face pressure to appear strong and decisive, which can make diplomatic compromise look like weakness. This internal dynamic can quietly undermine negotiations, even when there is an opportunity for de-escalation. As diplomatic options begin to close, military strategies start to take priority. Decisions are made faster, often with limited room for revision, and actions are taken based on immediate objectives rather than long-term stability. This shift increases the likelihood of rapid escalation, because there are fewer pauses in which both sides can reassess and step back. The absence of effective diplomacy doesn't just remove a solution, it removes time. And in conflicts like this, time is often the most critical factor in preventing situations from reaching a point where they can no longer be controlled or reversed. As tensions continue to rise, the possibility of this conflict expanding into a much larger, global-scale confrontation becomes increasingly real. What begins as a focused dispute between a few nations can quickly evolve into something far more complex once additional countries start getting involved, whether directly through military action or indirectly through support, alliances, and strategic positioning. One of the key reasons this risk is growing is because of how interconnected global politics has become. Countries are bound by defense agreements, economic partnerships, and shared strategic interests. When one nation takes a significant step forward, its allies may feel obligated to respond, not necessarily because they want to escalate the situation, but because their commitments and credibility are on the line. This creates a chain reaction, where involvement spreads beyond the original parties. Military buildups in and around the region further amplify this risk. The presence of advanced weapons systems, naval fleets, and air power from multiple countries operating in close proximity increases the chances of accidental encounters or unintended escalation. A single misinterpreted move, such as an aircraft entering restricted airspace or a missile defense system reacting to a perceived threat, can trigger a response that rapidly spirals into a broader conflict. Another important dimension is the role of proxy groups and regional allies. These groups often operate with their own motivations but are connected, directly or indirectly, to larger powers. If they engage in attacks or retaliatory actions, it can pull their supporting nations deeper into the conflict. This adds layers of unpredictability because not all actions are centrally controlled, and responses may be based on incomplete or rapidly changing information. Economic factors also play a significant role in expanding the scope of conflict. Disruptions in key regions can affect global oil supply, trade routes, and financial markets. As these impacts spread, countries that might not have a direct military interest in the conflict could still become involved in order to protect their economic stability. This transforms the situation from a military issue into a global crisis affecting multiple sectors at once. There is also the psychological factor of deterrence and power projection. Nations may increase their involvement not just in response to immediate threats, but to demonstrate strength and prevent future challenges. This can lead to an environment where multiple countries are actively positioning themselves, each trying to assert influence, which raises tensions even further. As more players enter the scene, communication becomes more complicated and coordination becomes more difficult. Each country has its own objectives, red lines, and thresholds for action. When these overlap or conflict with one another, the margin for error becomes extremely small, and even carefully calculated decisions can lead to unintended consequences. Another deeply concerning layer in this situation is the growing discussion around nuclear capabilities and how that could shift the entire balance of power. Even the possibility that a country might move closer to developing or deploying nuclear weapons changes how every other nation reacts. It raises the stakes from a conventional conflict to something far more dangerous, where the consequences are no longer limited to a specific region. When conversations about nuclear weapons begin to surface more openly, it signals a shift in strategic thinking. It suggests that traditional military options may no longer be seen as sufficient for deterrence or defense. Instead, there is a move toward capabilities that can guarantee a level of influence and security through sheer destructive potential. This kind of shift doesn't happen lightly, and it often reflects a belief that the current balance is no longer working. For other countries, this creates immediate pressure to reassess their own strategies. If one nation is perceived to be advancing toward nuclear capability, its rivals may feel compelled to respond, either by strengthening their own arsenals or by taking preemptive measures to prevent that capability from becoming a reality. This dynamic introduces a constant sense of urgency, where decisions are made under the assumption that time may be limited. There is also the issue of uncertainty. Nuclear programs are often surrounded by secrecy, incomplete information, and conflicting reports. This lack of clarity makes it difficult for other nations to accurately assess the level of threat. In such an environment, assumptions can quickly replace facts, and worst-case scenarios begin to shape policy decisions. This increases the likelihood of overreaction, where actions are taken based on what might happen rather than what has already happened. The presence of nuclear considerations also changes military calculations on every level. Strategies that might be acceptable in a conventional conflict become far riskier when there is even a small chance of nuclear escalation. Command structures, response times, and rules of engagement all become more sensitive because the margin for error is dramatically reduced. Beyond the military aspect, there is a psychological impact on both governments and the public. The idea that a conflict could involve nuclear weapons introduces a level of fear and uncertainty that goes far beyond typical geopolitical tensions. It influences decision-making, public opinion, and international reactions, often pushing leaders toward more cautious but also more defensive positions. At the same time, the global community tends to react strongly to any signs of nuclear escalation. Diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and international scrutiny increase rapidly, creating additional layers of tension. Countries may find themselves balancing between advancing their strategic goals and avoiding the severe consequences that come with crossing certain nuclear-related thresholds. What makes the current situation even more dangerous is how unpredictable it has become. Unlike structured conflicts where actions follow somewhat expected patterns, this environment is filled with rapid developments, shifting strategies, and decisions that can change within hours. That level of uncertainty makes it extremely difficult for any side to accurately anticipate what comes next. One of the biggest challenges in an unpredictable situation is the risk of miscalculation. A move that is intended as a warning or a defensive measure can easily be interpreted as an aggressive escalation by the other side. When communication is limited or strained, these misunderstandings become more likely, and responses are often based on perception rather than confirmed intent. This can quickly create a cycle where each side reacts to what they believe is happening, rather than what is actually happening. Another factor contributing to this unpredictability is the speed at which information spreads. News, reports, and even unverified claims can circulate globally within minutes, influencing public opinion and putting pressure on decision-makers. Leaders may feel compelled to act quickly in response to developing narratives, even if the full details of a situation are not yet clear. This reduces the time available for careful analysis and increases the chances of impulsive decisions. Military operations themselves also add to the uncertainty. When multiple forces are active in the same region, coordinating movements and avoiding unintended encounters becomes far more complex. Small incidents, such as a misidentified aircraft or an accidental crossing of boundaries, can escalate rapidly if they are interpreted as deliberate actions. In a tense environment, there is very little room for error. Internal dynamics within each country further complicate the situation. Leadership changes, political pressures, and differing opinions among decision-makers can all influence how a country responds at any given moment. This means that responses are not always consistent or predictable, adding another layer of complexity for other nations trying to assess the situation. There is also the issue of long-term consequences being overshadowed by short-term reactions. In highly volatile situations, decisions are often made to address immediate threats or pressures, without fully considering how those actions might shape future developments. This can lead to a series of choices that, while logical in the moment, collectively push the situation toward greater instability. All of these elements combine to create an environment where control is limited and outcomes are uncertain. Even well-planned strategies can be disrupted by unexpected events, and once a situation begins to move in an unintended direction, it becomes increasingly difficult to bring it back under control.